And of course, as you know, Hoyt and Betsy are in Italy, and Tim and Ellen left for San Francisco today, and they're flying to meet Hoyt and Betsy in Italy tomorrow, and none of them are going to be back until October the 8th, which means two of the elders are gone, and that leaves me, and some things are going to change. No. Ooh, did that get recorded? But anyway. But we want, actually, I'm soliciting prayers for them to get them back safely anyway. We want that in any case. What I want us to first of all look at, and where we left off a few weeks ago, just to be reminded, is we're talking about the historicity of the Bible. In reliability, we're taking what's often referred to as the lower road when it comes to textual criticism. Don't think of lower as being something that's bad or not as good as something else. It's just the method by which we look at the manuscripts and the fragments, so forth, of the Scripture, of the antiquitous work of the Bible. And we had left off a few weeks ago, in any case, with the New Testament manuscripts. And just to be reminded that what we have extant available to us are over 5,300 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament. 10,000 plus Latin manuscripts. Many of those would take us from anywhere from like the 6th century, even up to the 10th, 11th, 12th century. But these become very important manuscripts as there have been numerous copies from older manuscripts. 9,300 manuscripts in other languages, very well known Assyrian translation called the Peshitta, and Slavic, Ethiopic, Coptic, which is Egyptian, of course, and then Armenian. One of the things that Tim went over with you last week was defining some of these terms when it comes to the papyri. You will notice in some literature that there's kind of a strange-looking little, very artistic-looking B, but it is the really the abbreviation for the papyrus literature. But those that don't do that, some references will simply use a P with a number because there are so many papyri, and so that is that these were literally sheets, and that were written and discovered, leaves, if you will, of sheets. And I mean, there are just numerous papyri, and they typically will number them by putting a P, and then let's say in the smaller number, a small number like a 65 or 103 or whatever, and how they identify them. And these have been individually listed and cataloged. You can go online on the individual papyri and to find out information for each individual papyri. It's amazing. And what that does is that helps us to better appreciate the abundance of the biblical literature that we have, and of how busy individuals were in the copyists, what are called copyists, those that were involved in writing and copying the various manuscripts that we have in the Bible. Eventually, we're going to be talking more about the Muratorian fragment. I put approximately 170. That is as late. There are some that believe the Muratorian fragment could have been as early as 145, but what was the completion of at least a list of the 27 books of the New Testament. And when you think about it, that's not too many years after the death of the Apostle John, who died around the turn of the century. And then I know Tim talked to you as well about the patristics. And one of the books I was going to bring up, and I didn't, that's all right. But if you're familiar with Bauer, Art, and Gingrich, and it's a very valuable book in reference to the history of the Greek language. Well, one of the things of its many citations is not just the antiquitous biblical literature, but it also has the use of Greek words in the classical age that would take us back to fellows like Aristotle and so forth and before, but also of how the words were used by the so-called church fathers, particularly in the 2nd to the 4th century AD. That is so many years after the death of the Apostle John, but how there was literature written, sometimes commentaries that were written and used the phrases, the words, and it is a volume that just shows how these words were used, what they meant, and their particular setting. It's a very valuable work. And so there's a lot of these things that we're going to continue to be talking about as time goes on. The other thing that we did, just very quickly, to just give, and if you remember, this again goes back 3 or 4 weeks ago, because there was even a singing in there while we were gone, wasn't there? So this is nearly a month ago when we looked at this. And again, so by way of comparison, that when you want to talk about the classics versus New Testament manuscripts, and the New Testament was written roughly between 48 and 100 AD, and we have the earliest copies of New Testament literature that we have, of Greek literature, is 125 AD, which is not very many years away from the original, especially when you see what's going to happen next. So that's a span of only 25 years and over 5,300 copies of ancient material. When we looked at some of these classics, and some of these fellows are historians, some of them were politicians, senators, some of them were novelists, statesmen, a variety of different things in the Grecian, really the Greco-Roman society, influenced by the Grecian, the Hellenists, if you will, but from Homer to Tacitus, Livy, Caesar, Euripides. I want you to look that even of Homer, who's a very well-known author, and we talked about this about a month ago, that the date of some of his writings is approximately 900 BC. The earliest of any of his writings are copies, no original autographs, would be 500 years later discovered, 400 BC. That's a 500-year period span. And of all of his work, we only have 643 copies. And some of those are copies that are much, much later than that. And so if you look at the span and of some of these. So from Tacitus, Livy, Caesar, Julius Caesar, Euripides. Look at Julius Caesar and some of his writings, and he was a prolific writer. And yet, while he lived from 100 to 44 BC, remember BC time is working down, is that no copies of his writing, not original autographs, but copies, were not even discovered until about 900 AD. That's a span of 1,000 years. You see the separation of when these things were written and then the copies that we have. And yet, we look at them and we seem to have a certain degree of trust. And Euripides' writings, living from 480 to 406, 1,500 years, and only 9 manuscripts that are even available, that are extant. And I had some other examples here as well. But you look at the last couple of individuals that are pretty well known in Plato and Aristotle, Grecian philosophers that predated Jesus, the birth of Jesus, by a couple of centuries. More than that, actually. 250, 300 years and better. That when we look at the writings of Plato and Aristotle, and again, the earliest copy of any Plato's work was not till 900 AD, 1,200 years, of Plato, and of Aristotle, of a span of 1,100 years. And again, only 5 copies of Aristotle's work, only 7 copies of Plato's work. Now, compare that with the biblical literature. Over 5,300 copies. And all I can say to you that this is the subjective part of the faith issue. All I can say to you in all of that is that my faith in God and His preserving His Word, I look at this and see God's providence all over. Even though there are so many times were there societies that were trying to rid the world, eradicate the Bible from the world. Yeah, absolutely, many, many times. And yet they've not been able to do that at all. And so this just kind of puts things in that historical perspective. The next thing I want to do, and this is on page 22, and if I could have a little bit of help here, because I put this in another format. Thanks, Bryce. Bob, could you hand these out on this side? And this basically is what you're going to find on page 22 with a couple of changes, but highlighted in some ways. That's going to be easier even than what I did. I did this about a month ago, but I went ahead and put this together this week in the handout that you're getting. Because the very next thing that I want to talk to you about are when it comes to what are referred to as copyist errors. Copyist errors. And there are numerous copyist errors within biblical literature. And we're going to see, and we'll be getting to it in just a bit. I have another handout in a little bit. All the material that you see on page 23, thank you. All the material you see on page 23, you're going to get another handout that's going to be much larger because that's very difficult to read and some of it's faded and so forth. But I want us to look at this first. And I went ahead, I'll just leave this up. But it's really the handout is better. Thank you, Bob. Appreciate it, guys. Now, what happens, and you know, we'll just read this paragraph together, the one that I've got on the handout, the new handout tonight. Because this is an example of transposition of letters in John chapter 5 and verse 39. Now, when we say that, even today, we use that term because of computering, of texting, emailing, and so forth. What do we mean by transposing or transposition? What does that mean in that transposition?
You may have the right letters for the word, but they're not in the right order.
Yeah, they may be mixed up. And so that's probably the most known, best known form of transposition. And then there are times that there can be the omission of letters as well, or the repetition of letters. The word order, obviously, in transposing in that way. We have a very, very interesting situation in John chapter 5, verse 39. Now, Dennis, did you bring your King James Version of the Bible with you? Yeah. I'd like you to take it and read. And this is interesting. John chapter 5 and verse 39, nice and loud for everybody to hear, okay?
Search the Scriptures, for in them you think you have eternal life, and they are they which testify of me.
All right. Now, the King James Version, which was based upon the received text called the Textus Receptus, but one of the manuscripts that was very much depended upon for the Textus Receptus, one of the codex, it's called the Codex Bezae. And it is very interesting because that's a particular codex that made a major mistake in this passage. And that originally, in certain copies, the mistake was included in. Now, the Translation Committee of the King James Version, which finally, what we know as the King James Version of the Bible, we often say 1611. 1611, right? I guarantee you, if we had a copy, original 1611 copy of the King James Version today, well, number one, it'd be worth a lot of money. But number two, you would have great difficulty reading it. You'd have great difficulty reading it. Shapes of letters, spelling of words, syntactically, even the arrangement of the words. Okay, and so this is very interesting. And one of the things that I have on the Codex Bezae, by the way, that in this, the Greek that you have, that originally what the Codex Bezae said was you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life. And who's speaking here, by the way? Who's speaking in John 5:39? Jesus is. So Jesus says you search the Scriptures because you think that in them you have eternal life, and they or the sin about me. Did that make sense to anybody? These Scriptures reveal the sin, or the Scriptures are the sin about Jesus. That's problematic. Now, what you have, and I've got it up there, but I think, and the reason why I put it this way is because I did a little highlighting in yellow. See that? Now, let's read the paragraph that we have here first. And an entirely different word and meaning of a passage can be formed by the simple addition, omission, or transposition of a few letters. The result can totally depredate the original intention. In the following example, into the first two Greek lines that I have down with their English translation, the ancient scribe of Codex Bezae Cantabrigidae Genesis, and the manuscript, that's manuscript D, that's referred to often in just as abbreviation, the D manuscript, has unwittingly, unknowingly, executed a glaring theological fiasco. A contributing factor to this kind of mistake is the fact that letters of most early manuscripts all ran together in one solid line. Mixing this together with a little inattentiveness or interruption and you easily produce an errant text. These same letters have been separated in the third Greek line in English translation. The final grouping is the correct text with the diacritical and breathing marks that I decided to include at the bottom. Now let's look at this. I want you to put your eyes on, it kind of reminds me of, you got some of these games that you find, you can buy books or in the newspaper, and maybe it's got a block, this square of all these letters, and you have to put a circle around the words, right? And find the words. And can you imagine that when it came to many of these manuscripts, especially in the uncials, that when it came to the manuscripts, you just had these running lines of Greek letters, and there was no separation between the letters and the words. Even if we wrote, we know English well, and we'd be able to pick it out, but it'd take a little more work. Can you imagine if you just went ahead and wrote a book, and you did no separation between words, no separation in sentences, no separation in paragraphs, but just a running line of letters? Would that not take you probably take more concentration, a little longer to read it that way than having it nice and divided up? That's so interesting to me that this was the style of writing that was done. And in the uncials, in the cursives, we will find that had been the case. Now, what I want you to notice here is that this is the Greek line that we have in the last part of John chapter 5 and verse 39 that Dennis read for us. And what you have in this is you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 words in that line. You can count those because I've got them separated down in the third section there. And they are which testify concerning me. I had to really put Sam on the spot for some Greek, but that would not be fair to Sam. He's thinking about getting married, so that just wouldn't be fair. But as we look at this line, and you've got the common conjunction in kai, and a pronoun, and ekene, and essen, they are which. And now this is very interesting. When you look at this next word, and which, and I've included the yellow, but if you count on that top of the first yellow thing, see the thing that looks like an A? Well, that is an alpha. And it looks like an I, and that is an iota. And then that weird looking letter next, that's the M letter in Greek. That's an M, as in mother. And then see what looks like a P? That's an R. T-U-R-O. And the word martyrio or martyro, well, what does that even sound like? Martyr, because martyrs testify, their lives serve as a testimony. Now, that's what's in the original. And Jesus says, and they are the ones testifying concerning me. And you can imagine a scribe in the Codex Bezae, as the scribes were working on this, and if he is tired, or if he's distracted, interrupted, or he just kind of, glances at a word, and how many times have we ever been reading something, and we're glancing at words, and we assumed that a word was something, when in reality, in fact, it was not actually that word. And this is probably what he did, because what's so interesting about that, in that codex, this was discovered. When you look at the next line, what we have now, all that yellow and the second yellow one there, that alpha, and then when you have the meme, the alpha, the rho, the tape there, the alpha, the nu, and the omicron, that is hamartano. If I say to you hamartia is the Greek word for what? To miss the mark, sin. When he transcribed, when he copied this, he, just doing his work, was convinced that that was the word, and totally. Now, it would end up being caught, and the beautiful thing about having this abundance of manuscripts, you could take that and then check and balance it against other existing manuscripts, and there was not another manuscript of the hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of manuscripts that had any form, any cognate form of sinning there whatsoever. Therefore, we can conclude, what about this? He made a mistake. Now, it's not Jesus that made the mistake, and that's not John's original autograph of the Gospel of John, whose mistake was it was a copyist error. You're going to find copyist errors with all the abundance of the copies of manuscripts. But what is so amazing to me that I think is, and this takes honesty, that when we're looking at these ancient writings, but what is just absolutely amazing to me is that we have so many copies, so many different copies of so many different languages even, that we are able to determine and come up with what we know is the correct word, the correct translation. And so this obviously was something that was a mistake. And so, when you come down to the next, and look, all that has to happen is that what he did is he put an alpha in front of that mar part, and then instead of going to ru or to ro, he did tanu, and next thing you know, he has hamartano, and which is a participial form of sin, is sinning. What a mistake. You see, what Jesus said in reference to the scriptures, these scriptures, and they testify concerning me. They don't have anything to do with sinning concerning me. Is that a bit of a mistake? It's a copyist error. Questions or comments? Does that make sense to everybody? And it's really important. And so what I've done then is in the last section of John, on the bottom of the page, John 5:39, with the diacritical and breathing marks. Now, what's helped out here is that through the years in the Greek language, then in order to help pronounce words, and breathing is everything. And to give you an example here, that when I want you to look at this, in at the very bottom where you have that one word that looks like Kai, right? K-A-I. And then you have they. But I want you to look on the second word, which is ekene. Over the E, do you see that little mark that's over the first letter? Over the E, over the epsilon, okay? Now notice how that is going this way. But now go to the 1, 2, 3, 4th word, where it looks like an AI, and look at the mark that is over the iota, over the I there. What direction is that going? The opposite. Those are breathing marks. And when it is in that opposite direction, now you give a to it. So it's not a, but it's he. So these breathing marks, because they knew that naturally as Greek-speaking people. So those are breathing marks. These other marks, though, like back to the end, over the iota, that is an inflection mark, but that's an emphasis, but an inflection mark. That little look almost looks like a bird's eye thing over on the second word. You see that little bird's eye? That's called the circumflex, and that's just basically showing an accent on that diphthong. When we say a diphthong, and this is true in English and definitely true in Greek, what do we mean when we say a diphthong? It's very critical in understanding Greek. What is a diphthong? What's a dipstick? It's got nothing to do with that. But anyway, a diphthong is when you put two vowels together and they make one sound. Janet, you knew that. You just not going to speak up on here. But I mean, I think some of you knew that. But it's when you put two vowels together that make a singular sound. And so that circumflex is even showing that. And even think about our word 8. That is the number 8. E-I-G-H-T. That's a diphthong. And typically, the E-I is a long vowel. It is pronounced as a long A, like 8. Okay? And so that's what these diacritical markings and these breathing markings are for, because They will help with pronunciation, they will help with breathing, and they will help with pace. Because to Greeks, pace was everything. So enough about that part of it. But what I want us to see, this is a very, very critical thing, is that there were on occasions in certain manuscript, there was simply the transposition. And I had gone and saw some variations in the Gospel of John by itself, and some of the various manuscripts that exist, but in the Codex Bezae, there was a variation. In John 1:4, John 4:51, John 4:9, John 5:4, obviously 5:39, John 6:1, John 7:8, John 8:46. Whatever reason was omitted from the Codex Bezae, although it's found in a multiplicity of other manuscripts. And so you're going to find that. There might be a temptation with some to say, well, wait a minute, look at all those mistakes. That's why we can't depend upon the Bible. But in reality, with our approaching this and with all the multiple manuscripts that we have, then are we able to kick out the variant texts, that when there are texts that are not found within the consistency of the whole, then we think, oh, okay. And so many of these were unintentional, a transposition of a letter. Okay. So that brings us to the next page. But anybody have any questions on that? Does that make sense to everybody in these transposition? Okay, guys, I got another. You did so good job. Let's do it again. On your side. Now, this is material that you see on page number 23. I'm just going to black rid of this. All right, page 23. I gave away mine. Thanks. Copyist errors in the New Testament text, but unintentional changes. And there's some fascinating. I'm going to cover a few of these because we basically have a few minutes. We can do this. You'll be able to read it, but first of all, this is so much more readable than what you have in the material on page 23. Thanks, Bob. And so when we look at this in the mistaken letters, definition, obviously, similar-looking letters were sometimes interchanged. Now, what we have here in uncial script, and in the uncial script, we have a pronoun here, and we have the name for God, os and theos. I've got it Greek. I did not transliterate any of this, but the definition is that you sometimes have letters, and the same thing is going to be true in Hebrew. There are some letters in Hebrew that are very, very, very similar, and just a little stroke shows the difference. But we have an interesting situation in 1 Timothy 3:16. And again, Dennis, I'm going to call upon you, if you would read 1 Timothy 3:16. And go ahead and read that if you would.
3:16?
Yes.
And without controversy, great is the mystery of godliness. God was manifest in the flesh, justified in the spirit, seen of angels, preached unto the Gentiles, believed on in the world, received up into glory. All right.
Now, Annette, you have a New American Standard Bible with you? Go ahead and read that in 1 Timothy 3:16. 1 Timothy 3:16.
3:16.
Mm-hmm.
And by common confession, great is the mystery of godliness. He who was revealed in the flesh was vindicated in the spirit, beheld by angels, proclaimed among the nations, believed on in the world, taken up in glory.
Now, what's very interesting in this, God, and the translations have corrected it, but in a couple of the translations, now, where it says os, and that's the Omicron Sigma, 1 Timothy 3:16, two manuscripts, and you see that funny looking letter, that first squiggly line there in the parentheses, that is the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet. and that represents the Codex Sinaiticus. That when they came up with the Sinaiticus, when they discovered the Sinaiticus, this very, very important copy of the New Testament, they felt that it was so important that they assigned it the first letter of the Hebrew alphabet, which is the Aleph. The Aleph, so that's it. The A is the Alexandrinus, another important one. In that, there was a confusion, and what you find in the text, instead of theos, there was just an os, and that is who. But when we look at the corrected Sinaiticus, that's why it says, has that with it. See the little 2 in the Aleph there? And where it says God. And so they were confused in some of the uncial manuscripts. This was simply a matter of mistaken letters. And that happens. That's going to happen from time to time. And so there were a couple of manuscripts that had os instead of theos, God. And God is obviously who it's talking about. But in some of the copyist errors, they were unintentional. There was simply a mix-up, a confusing of the letters that were done. Okay? You have another one in homophony. And this is the substitution of similar words. And in Romans 5:1, you have a similar sounding, I'll just go ahead and pronounce these in Greek, an ekumen. We have, and it shows the codices that was found in, as opposed to ekomen. Look at the difference. The difference, and they both sound very much the same. That the one has just what looks like what's called an omicron. The other one has the omega, what looks like the W. Do you see the difference in the third letters? But the words sound the same, but written as such, it's a different cognate form. So it would have we have, as opposed to let us have, or we may have, and those were confused. Okay? So there's going to be some of those where they sound the same, but on the written page, now we have homophones all the time. In fact, you look at the word there, T-H-E-R-E or T-H-E-I-R, even T-H-Y apostrophe R-E, although it's going to be elongated. But these were copyist errors that are found from time to time, but they're totally unintentional and very resolvable. And then there's something that's called haplography. That is the omission of a letter or word, usually due to a similar letter or word in the text. In John 1:13, we have this word egene theneson, and that is from the lexical word, is that next one, which is guillaume. Notice it says P31, that's papyrus, found there in the Alexandrinus, as well as see, not the Vaticanus, but the help me, I just gone blank on. So we have the Alexandrinus, Sinaiticus, and Vaticanus. Sinaiticus, and so what you have there is these. All what happened was a similar word. It was very, very similar, because in the spelling of the word, look at the next Greek word. See where it looks like it has 2 V's? Those are N's, by the way. The one above only has 1, but you see in the next one where it looks like an E and a Y, which is G, by the way. E and a VV, those are 2 N's. Did everybody see that? Well, that is from a completely different lexical form of geneo, and these were confused. Both forms can mean we're born, but they come from different roots. It didn't really change too much in the meaning, but it was, in fact, a copyist error. It was a copyist error. Then just think about didography. If I say ditto, what does that usually mean when I say ditto? You do it again. And so this is a letter or word that has been written twice rather than once. And we have some examples of that as well. In Mark 3:16, and kai epoeson, dodeca. You have dodeca. And he appointed the 12 is a possible ditto from verse 14, and where it had been repeated. And then, so they're wondering if in that particular manuscript that he had inadvertently just went ahead and used the word again, because so many of the manuscripts did not have that word twice. Did it hurt the text? Technically, no. But was it a copyist error? Yes. Here's what I'm saying with all of this. You guys can read this and do the research on it. You can Google it. What I wanted to illustrate is that I've read so much literature, and they'll say, you know that there are literally thousands of errors in the biblical text. How many of you have heard stuff like that? But these are that sometimes it's simply misspelled words, transposition of letters, repeated. Sometimes some text that where a word has been omitted, completely omitted, not even found there. Now, if we only had one or two manuscripts, just a small handful of manuscripts, and you have that kind of a problem, you have a problem. But now just suppose, and we're closed with this because we're out of time, just suppose that I write an article out, and I ask every one of you to take this article and to go home this week, and I want you to sit down with pen and paper, and I want you to, in your cursive style, but I want you to write out this complete article in your handwriting using cursive, and then hand it in to me. Now, for about the 25, 30 people, however many people are here, when I got those all in, do you think that there would be 100% agreement on the written page? I mean, you're going to probably find some variations, and that's just a handful of people. That is, so if we only had just a few manuscripts like that, and we look at it and say, yeah, that is problematic. But the fact, because we have literally thousands and thousands of manuscripts and fragments and so forth, y'all can come in. Because of that, let me tell you, we have a checks and balance. And we know what is intentional and what is non-intentional. Next week, we're going to talk about some intentional things. What's probably the most glaring intentional copyist error? That's not just an unintentional, but a copyist that inserted something that was totally erroneous in the New Testament. What do you think is probably one of the most glaring examples of an intentional mistake? Yeah, there it is. Acts 12 and verse 4. The putting in the word Easter. What is the Greek word there? Pascha, Passover. But King James demanded that they put in, it was an intentional thing, to put Easter in. You don't read about Easter in the Bible. There is no such thing as Easter in the Bible. Newsflash, right? But that was an intentional thing. So we'll talk a little bit about that next week and then get on to section 5 as well. All right. That's it. Thank you very much. Appreciate your good attention.